Okay. We're at the top of the page. It starts out, number 1, not a body. We had just finished that first point.
It's actually the bottom of page 2.
On ours, it's bottom of page 2. Just formatting, I guess.
I'm sorry, okay.
What is it? I'm sorry, what does the page say?
It says not a body.
Divine and not a body.
Yeah, okay, I have to remember my formatting is always going to be different than yours, because I know
Also,
that,
actually, that should be point number 4.
I guess so.
Yeah, it's the other before.
It's under point 3.
It's under point 3, but there's a point 3 above it.
There is.
Point 3 and point 3.
Okay.
Point 3 are
On
not
our
linked
copy.
across each
I
other.
always do things like that.
Oh,
That's
now I
right.
found it.
And you found it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
not a body.
Just,
Okay, not a body. We did that one already.
I got no body.
Yes.
But I have more to say about it. The meaning, of course, that God is not material. Please notice that we have a terrible time when we're trying to talk about the nature of God, because we have to start with not only the physical world, but we have to start with that which we can sense. We don't sense much of the world. We have 5 external senses, and those are the gateways for all of our knowledge of all material reality. And I couldn't even guess the percentage of material reality that is not sensible. When was the last time you ever sensed a quark or a positron, or for that matter, the radio waves that are passing through this room right now, and you don't perceive them? So that's why we human beings are natural materialists. We're natural senses, because all that we know is filtered through our 5 senses. It's almost impossible for us to imagine something that is not material. So when we say God is spiritual, what we are really saying is God is not material. It's what we call technically a negative judgment of separation, in which you are saying God is a being, and this being is not material. So you are making a judgment which is affirming a reality of which you are denying the quality. And you're denying the quality that describes everything that we experience. So it's really a rather remarkable thing when you say there are beings that are totally unlike the world in which we live and unlike our actual experience of this world. That's why it is so natural for people to have difficulty believing in the reality of these things. It's just contrary to our nature. It has nothing to do with the intelligibility or the credibility of non-material things. It has everything to do with the limitations of our modes of knowing, our ways of knowing things. It's us that is the problem, in other words. So God, of course, looking at the prima via, the first way, concludes that God is pure act. When you're dealing with material things, you're dealing with things that matter, consider, is pure potency. So matter is about as far as you can get from God. So when we say God is not a body, we are affirming that he is as distant as you can get from material reality. I think it was David of Dinant who said, St. Thomas refers to it, he doesn't get passionate on many things, but he says, David of Dinant, stultissime, most stupidly, said that God was pure prime matter. That's about as far as you can get from God, as short of saying just non-being. So God is pure act. God is pure spirit. And this, of course, is to answer and deny naturalism. Naturalism would reduce everything just to the physical world. The whole point of the proofs for God's existence is to show that there is a being which is the ultimate cause for everything in the physical world, and that being is not like the things in the physical world. Naturalism, of course, says the world just explains itself. Any good proof for God's existence attacks that very proposition and says the world does not explain itself. Pantheism has the same difficulty because it identifies the world at least partly with God, if not totally. And in so doing, it is making God a body, but God is not a body, so you can't have pantheism. The ideal pantheist is Baruch Spinoza. When you talk about pantheism, he's the guy, at least in Western thought, that you primarily think about. And he starts out proving God's existence by just taking the definition of substance. Substance is that which exists in itself and through itself. So obviously it exists. It doesn't need anything else. But you see, that's another version of the ontological argument, where you just start with the idea of God and thereby, from the idea, draw the existence of God. The problem is, as St. Thomas would point out, you can't demonstrate existence of anything just from an idea. You have to use some kind of a proof that starts with the real world, because that's the foundation point for your argument. If you don't start with a real being, how are you going to conclude the real being? So instead of taking just a concept or idea of being, you start with the physical world as it is sensed in the first way, that which is certain and most evident to the senses, namely that some things are in motion, which again is given to us by sensation. Any questions about this first point? God is not a body. Number 2, simplicity. And it sounds like a simple point. Well, not really. Again, God is pure act. There's no potency in God. The meaning of this, and by the way, notice I say it's a key concept. There are 2 key concepts. Don't look it up in a book, you won't find it anywhere. They're my key concepts for God. One is simplicity, the other is eternity, because those are the notions that all of the other attributes kind of swing around. And in terms of which you've got to get these 2 right. You've got to get simplicity right, you've got to get eternity right. Get those 2 right, and the rest of them will make a lot more sense. Simplicity means that God is not composed of parts, principles, or substances. You recall in a previous lecture we were talking about the Trinity, which of course is defending the Christian doctrine of the Trinity against the claim that it entails a kind of polytheism. But we are going to here affirm the absolute monotheistic character of God, not only that there is one God, but that God is as simple a being as is possible. You might say, well, but then how could he be triune? Well, the point is, that's the most simplicity you're ever going to get. Everything else entails greater composition. God is pure act, no potency. God is the being whom we have shown in prior lectures is the only being whose essence is its act of existence. Every other being has this fundamental composition within it that its essence is really distinct from its act of existence. Therefore, every other being entails greater composition than you find in God. But just at the starting point. It is hard for us, though, to understand what we mean when we say God is absolutely simple. It amounts, though, to this. You can compare it to ourselves. In us, there is a distinction between form and matter, a distinction between soul and body, a distinction between our soul and our intellectual powers. There are 2 of them, the active and the potential intellect. We'll go into that tonight. There is the will, the intellective appetite. There are the acts of the intellect and the acts of the will. In God, all those things I just mentioned, except matter, are substantially identical. Absolutely identical. God's acts of knowing are identical to his intellect, and his intellect is identical to his substance. And his substance is identical to his will, and his will is identical to his acts of choice. And his acts of choice are identical to his intellect. And his acts of understanding are identical to his will. That's what simplicity means. Everything in God is identical substantially to every other thing in God. The only distinction, which is raised by revelation, is this real distinction of relation between the terms of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The only distinction. But everything else in God is the same. When I said in us form and matter are the same, of course God has no matter, because matter is a principle of limitation, and God is infinite. By the way, one of the things that's a little bit hard to teach about this is we're dealing with concepts, some of which will refer to other concepts, other attributes. So when I talk about the infinity, that's another attribute that we'll take in a few minutes, but we haven't really taken it yet. And yet here it's appropriate that because God is infinite, he is also therefore not material, because material things are limited insofar as they are extended in space and time and limited by space and time. So that doesn't apply to God. Every quality of God is identical with the divine substance or essence. That's in your notes. In God, they are all identical. In man, substance, intellect, will, knowledge, and love are distinct. In God, they are all identical. So when we talk about these divine attributes or divine names, as we're going through in these classes right now, these attributes are all the same. In God, they're the same. Why then do we have a bunch of them? Why do we have an enumeration of them? Why do we distinguish between simplicity, goodness, infinity, unicity, omniscience, and so forth? We do so not because they're distinct in God, but because they are distinct in our understanding. It's our limitation. We are trying to understand something that is beyond our understanding. And that's why whenever we use terms, we have to spend a lot of time explaining how we're using them.
We kind of have to break God into pieces so we understand.
Yes, although he doesn't break into pieces.
He doesn't break, but we have to do it.
We break into pieces,
Yeah.
and we need to receive. Everything's received according to the mode of the receiver, and we are a very imperfect receiver. But understand, every time we use a term of God, remember, we're using it analogically. God is not material. God is spiritual, but the word spiritual means not material. We understand what matter is, but we don't really understand very well what non-matter is. But we know it's real. So we, in talking about the divine attributes, please understand, and all the way through we have to affirm this, that in a very real sense, the term, the analogical term predicated of God, is ineffable in a sense. It's beyond our ability to speak. It's beyond our ability to express. We are expressing something real. When we say God is wise, we take it from the understanding that man can be wise, and that this is a positive quality, a positive affirmation, a mode of knowledge, and it is found in God in an unlimited way. But do I understand what that means? No. The most I can understand is what I understand. The greatest wisdom I have that I really understand is my own, and that isn't much. And I know there's a lot of people who have more. God has infinitely more. I know that's true. There are a lot of things of God that we can say and affirm that it is a true statement, but we don't fully grasp the intelligibility of what we are referring to. And that's what happens when I say, God exists. I know that's a true statement. God exists necessarily. I know that's a true statement. I can reason to it. But I haven't got a clue what the existence of God means in itself, or why he is necessary in himself. I can't get into that. I can't get into the divine essence. We believe, those who accept the revelation of the beatific vision, that this will attain some degree of participation in the experience of the divine essence for human beings who attain it. But we surely don't have that in this world or in this life, and therefore all of these attributes we're discussing, we have to understand. It's easy to stand up and just say, well, this is what it is, and this explains it, but please understand, every time I say anything like that, I'm not really explaining it. I'm referring to an infinitely transcendental, mysterious reality, something utterly beyond this world or anything we could ever imagine. And we're kind of describing it from the outside, little bits and pieces that we can get a hold of. That's all that we have.
In this paragraph, you refer to the divine attributes. Is that a technical term, or does it include any language we would use like just, beautiful, truth?
Well, these are equated to the divine names.
What are the divine names?
That's what we're going through: simplicity, goodness,
Oh, these are the, okay, so
infinity.
these are the
Yeah,
divine
that's what the
names.
attributes mean. But they're not attributes as predicable accidents. They're not just qualities that you're affirming of God, like they were added to his substance. Because of the divine simplicity, they are his substance. And that gets you into some very interesting notions, some of which we'll describe later on. That means, for example, that God is his own choice. In God, there's only one choice. It's him. He's already made his choice, or choices, if you will, which are multiple on the part of the objects produced. We'll get into that when we get down to eternity, because it helps us to understand the relationship between God and the temporal world. So we're finished for now with simplicity, but we're going to go back to it. And we'll have to keep going back and forth between these various attributes all the time. But it is a key concept. It's key because you've got to try to get an insight which is very foreign to the way that we tend to think. We live in a world of multiplicity and diversity and change. And God is utterly beyond that. And in God, every quality of being that can be found is already possessed infinitely, unchangingly, and with any quality you mention being identical to his very substance. We're not used to thinking in those terms. And I must confess, I'm not really sure how each of you conceive of God, because I've been going over this material for the last 40 years. So I don't know how closely your understanding, which in many cases is derived probably from perfectly legitimate theological sources, I don't know how close it comes to what I'm talking about. So we'll just keep going through this, and if there seems to be a disparity, let me know. Goodness. God is pure goodness. How do you prove it? Well, again, very simple. Goodness is found in creatures. Goodness is a positive perfection. Now, I know there are objections people could raise, but let me just lay out the argument to begin with. We find in the world that there are good things. Good is something positive. The principle of causality tells us that God, in order to cause good things, must be preeminently good. All that we're using here is the principle that you don't get something from nothing. Nothing can give what it doesn't have. So if there is goodness in creatures, God must be good. God must have goodness. But remembering this is analogical. God not only has goodness, but because of the divine simplicity, God is goodness. God is his own goodness. Goodness, in fact, it turns out, is simply being. Remember, the primary definition of being is subsistent existence, subsistent being, be absolutely the ultimate foundation of every other existent. The definition of the good is being as desirable. The good, as Aristotle says, is that which all things desire. So, goodness is simply being, but from the point of view of being desirable. So, when we say that God is infinite goodness, we are really simply affirming that God is infinite being. And because of the divine simplicity, God is goodness with a capital G. I always thought it kind of neat that you got God, is good with one O missing. That, of course, raises the... and another point. When you talk about causality, every perfection that you find in creatures is preeminently contained in God. For that same basic principle. You can't give what you don't have. God could not give goodness to things if he did not possess goodness. He is not called good because he makes good things. But things are good because they are made by God. Got to get the horse in front of the cart here. Things have goodness because they are produced by the infinite good. St. Thomas gives an argument as to how you identify being and goodness in the following way. A being is good insofar as it is desirable. You might, if you're taking notes, you might want to just put insofar as. A being is good insofar as it is desirable. A being is desirable insofar as it is perfect. A being is perfect insofar as it is in act. And a being is in act insofar as it exists. Therefore, a being is good insofar as it exists. And notice that's not the normal syllogism where you've got a little is in the middle. It's an equivalence. Insofar as. So the subject and predicate are coterminous. They're equal. A being is good insofar as it's desirable. That's just the definition. Something is desirable insofar as it is perfect. Somebody might have painted the world's worst painting. And let's say it's a still life of vegetables. And he's got everything wrong. That's really a miserable painting. But you look down and you see one little part of it, he's got a tomato that's not quite as bad as the rest. And to the extent that that tomato, even to some extent, achieves the representation of tomato-ness, you'd say, well, there's something perfect about it. There's something desirable about it. Because that's the meaning of perfection. And I'd like to come back to it in a minute or two. I don't want to lose it. But when you talk about perfection, you're talking about something that is facio. It's made completely. It's made fully. It's made, well, how do you make something completely? There's a measure to anything. When you talk about making it completely, the only way you can measure completeness is according to a standard of nature. So the reason that tomato has an element of perfection about it is because, among other things which don't look anything like they should, that one at least looks a little bit like a tomato. And to that extent, there's some perfection about it. And to that extent, there's some desirability about it. So you see, there's a connection between desirability and perfection and nature. You couldn't have any notion of perfection if you didn't have some notion of nature. let's continue the perfection notion for a minute. A thing is perfect insofar as it's in act. In other words, insofar as it's fully there as what? Representing its nature. And of course, the final step, a thing's in act because it's real. It really is a fulfillment of that nature of looking like a tomato that makes it somewhat desirable because at least that part sort of looks like a tomato. So it is existence ultimately which is equated to goodness. Now, the connection is through nature. And by reference to nature, we can get the notion of evil too. Because when you say a horse is blind, what you are noticing is that it's lacking a perfection which is due to its nature. A horse ought to be able to see. If it fails to see, it's lacking the perfection, it's lacking the being, it's lacking the act of what pertains to the nature of horseness. And that's the nature of evil. Evil is the lack of a due perfection, the lack of a perfection that ought to be in something. And you can't understand evil if you don't have a reference to nature. Because if you're dealing with no nature, you've got no way to measure goodness or evil. But everything has a nature. So you can't avoid things either being good or evil, being good to the extent they fulfill their nature, evil to the extent they fall from it or fail from it. I just noticed I misspelled perfection. I got it spelled as prefection. So obviously the natural question arises, if God is all good, how come there's evil in the world? Well, we have to understand what is nature? Nature is what God makes. When God makes something, he can't just make being like it's sort of an amorphous marshmallow fluff. It's got to be something. And the measure of that being is the way that he makes it. That's what we call nature. He can't just make indefinite being. And to the extent, and again, because he's infinite goodness, he's perfect goodness, he's essential goodness, what he makes is good. Whatever he gives a nature to is good to the extent that it fulfills what he has made, because what he's making is the being of it, which comes from him who is pure goodness. So the only way we can understand evil is that in some way a thing is defective in reference to the way it was made. And that's the sense in which evil is the lack of a due perfection. It's very real. Illness is very real, but it's the lack of the perfection of health. It's a disorientation. Moral evil is very real, but it's a disordination of that which man ought to seek. So we will at a later time probably come back to the problem of evil on a grander scale. Obviously, that's so big you don't treat it by itself. You do treat it by itself. You don't treat it in this context. But I just want to give some introduction to the question at the same time we deal with the divine attribute of goodness. Do you have any questions?
Just to point out to the class, this is basically St. Thomas's outline you're following. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
It's in this. You could read more about this in the Sum.
Right.
And if you can plow through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a Thomist. Anything I tell you, I'm saying. I'm trying to say what St. Thomas says.
I was just saying for the sake of people doing other
Right.
reading.
Yes, and everything I'm going through, you're quite right. The Summa Theologiae, Book 1, Question 2, Article 3 is where he proves the existence of God. In the subsequent questions, he takes up first of all, he shows that the being which he's demonstrated, that has the nominal definition of God in the 5 ways. He says, this is the first mover unmoved, and this is what all men call God. That's a nominal definition. It isn't until a couple articles later that he shows that the qualities of God correspond to the traditional understanding of the meaning of God, so that what has been demonstrated is not merely nominally God, but is really God, that it's an essential definition of God, and that's where he demonstrates that God is he who is, you see, pure existence, and then he takes up all of the divine attributes, which is what we're going through here, roughly in the same order as the Summa. Infinity. God is subsistent being, being itself. Every other being gets its existence from God. So we are not subsistent beings, we are beings which exist as substances, but we are created beings. God alone is his own reason for being. We receive our reason for being from another. All creatures do. The meaning of infinity is that God is unlimited in being and all existential perfections. But remember, all those existential perfections are identical to his substance. When we say existential perfections, plural, we name them from the plurality of the things we see in the world around us. But in God they are one, because of the divine simplicity. God preeminently contains, that is, as the cause, he contains within his essence, within his nature, every perfection that is manifested in the world of creation. And an unlimited supply more. Because no matter what God creates, it's always finite. No matter what perfections he produces, they only partially express his being. In him, they are all one. Knowing himself, well, that's under omniscience. We'll get to that in a minute. That's why these things always feed back and forth on each other. How do we know that God is infinite? Ultimately, because God is pure existence. In God, his essence is identical to his existence. Well, a being whose essence is existence is a being that you can't take any existence away from. Remember, if you define a triangle, it belongs to the essence of a triangle to have 3 sides and have 3 angles. Take away a side, you don't have a triangle. Take away an angle, you don't have a triangle. God's essence is existence. Take away any existence, and you don't have God. If you have God, you have all possible existence, and that's what's meant by unlimited, infinite. Again, we're naming something indirectly. We do not have a direct notion of the infinite. We have a direct notion of the finite. Finis means end or limit. So I have a notion of this podium in front of me. I have a notion of, well, it's maybe 24 inches wide. But it's bounded, it's limited as to how far it goes. Now, since the top of it represents a kind of plane, I can imagine what would it be if it didn't have edges, if it didn't have a limit. So for geometrical purposes, I can abstract from this flat surface and imagine, what if you had an unlimited surface or an unlimited plane? So for purposes of geometry, we talk about lines and surfaces as if they are infinite. But we get the notion of infinity by negating the limit. It's a double negation. The finite limits it, and we say, well, it's what is not limited. It's what is not knotted. Because when you come to a limit, that's where the thing is not anymore. So by not knotting it, you have affirmed it without any restriction. And that's how we get the notion of infinite. Do we know what infinite is positively and directly? No. No. But we can talk about it intelligibly and intelligently using the means at our disposal. Just remember, we're doing it by indirect means. So when I talk about the spiritual, I'm just saying what is not material. I talk about the infinite, I'm saying what is not finite. That's all we can do. That doesn't mean what we say is untrue. It is a true judgment about a reality which is simply unlike the things of our experience and ultimately derived from our experience of the things of this world. When we talk about a spiritual magnitude, when we say God is infinite, we're talking about an infinity of power and completeness in being. When you think about God's infinity, those are the two primary characteristics. An infinity of being, for reasons I already said, an infinity of power because God creates. How much power does it take to create? I mean, we ought to instantly say infinite. That was a proof for the existence of God, which I've discussed with some of you in the past. The very fact that things exist. Why do they exist? How do they exist? By existing, they are standing outside of nothingness. There's a kind of insight here you can work up, but we don't have time to do it right now. But that beings, by the very fact that we are existing in this room, we are being created at this moment because we are standing outside of nothingness. Now, how do you measure power? Why does that immediately bring to the human mind the notion of infinite power? Power is measured by the distance from potency to act. How does that work? Well, how much power does it take to take some clay and model it into a little statue? It takes some power, doesn't it? Because the clay has the potency to take the shape of the statue, but it isn't there yet. You've got to move it around a little bit. Now, in the world around us, we can see how things can happen by the power of nature. How do you make a chicken? Well, it helps to start with some chickens, doesn't it? You can see how from chickens you could produce a chicken. That takes some power, though, doesn't it? You don't make it from rutabagas. It helps to start with chickens. But how much power would it take if it were possible to take a vegetable and turn it into an animal? Now that, as you know, that's part of the theory of evolution in a way, isn't it? You go from the lower to the higher. But you can see that would take a lot more power, wouldn't it? However it's done. You say, I don't even see how it can be done. But it surely would take more power. What we're doing here, and how much power then would it take to start with a rock? I mean, at least you start with a vegetable, you start with something alive. And then you go to something that's got alive and it's got senses too. But if you start with a rock, you start with something that isn't alive. Would that therefore not take more power than it would be to go from a vegetable to an animal, to go from a non-living thing to an animal? That takes more power because the distance from the potency to the act is greater. You're going from what could be to what is, and it's a bigger and bigger gap. How much power does it take to go from non-being to being? In all these prior examples, you could at least conceivably measure the distance, because you can think of what would be the difference between a vegetable and an animal, or between a non-living thing and an animal. how do you measure the distance between non-being and being? You can't measure it. If you can't measure it, then the distance between potency and act is without measure. But the very meaning of what is without measure is what is immeasurable or infinite. And that's why it takes infinite power to create. Thus, God, in the act of creating things, manifests an infinity of power. Okay, any questions about infinity? Unicity. I'm trying to think where seems to me I've seen a different word for the same thing. But anyway, unicity means there's just one God. And that this, of course, is the basis for monotheism. How do you prove that there can only be one God? Very simple, as we did some time back on the board when I was showing you. If you have multiple gods, if you've got multiple infinite beings, there's got to be a real difference between them. If there's a real difference, one's got something the other doesn't have. And if one doesn't have something the other's got, it's not infinite, therefore it's not God. If you have more than one God, one would limit the power of the other. So you can't have more than one God. Any polytheists in here want to debate me? But you see how interesting a balance you find within Christian thought, and how it confuses the daylights out of people. Because on the one hand, it is an absolutely monotheistic religion, but on the other hand, others looking at the doctrine of the Trinity think it says that it's really polytheistic. And that's why you have to very carefully explain that there is no contradiction in the doctrine of the Trinity. At the same time, you absolutely defend monotheism. And so it sort of makes me think of Chesterton's observation in the Romance of Orthodoxy, where he says it's like a man standing upright. There's only one angle at which you can stand upright. There are infinite angles at which you can fall over. There are infinite ways to get it wrong. And indeed, that's one of the things about metaphysics and philosophy in general. You get one principle wrong, and you're out of control. It reverberates through the rest of your system, destroys the whole thing. But conversely, what I find interesting about the divine attributes as we go through them, and I mentioned this to you before, remember what I talk about as the Santa Claus proof for God's existence. If this was Santa, as we go through these attributes, you'd find them conflicting with each other. And indeed, if you look up atheism on the internet, you'll find websites that just have a wonderful time tearing apart the concept of God because they don't understand it. And they'll make all kinds of allegations which only show that they didn't take the freshman course in metaphysics. Unfortunately, I mean, I look at some of the things that they write, and this is freshman stuff. They really are raising objections that are not objections if you know what you're talking about. The only thing I found rather appalling is I saw Dr. Paul Kurtz once on TV raising his objections to the existence of God, and they weren't much better than the freshmen. And I always would have my students ask me for a while after we'd be going through some of this stuff, well, what would a good atheist say about this? Well, I keep looking for one. I'm excited when I find one. But it is a problem to find one. I mean, a good one. Anthony Flew is pretty good. He's got a book out entitled God, A Critical Inquiry. And it is well done, by and large. He does know Thomistic philosophy. And if I didn't know what I know about the proofs for God's existence, and I wouldn't know most of it even if I studied it, even if I studied philosophy, I wouldn't know it except I happen to have written my dissertation on the topic. If I didn't know it, I would not realize the points of weakness in his arguments. He knows the arguments well enough to be able to find the points of weakness and gloss over them when he hits them, so that the book is absolutely deadly to the uninstructed. And the thought that this book has been disseminated to students all over Canada, the United States, is rather frightening in a way, because it's a very well done book. Towards the end, he manifests a pathological obsession with attacking what he calls organized religion, which is not really too surprising. If he had not done that, the efficacy of what he was doing in general, I mean, it becomes kind of a diatribe against Christianity, but if it were not for that, his grasp of the philosophical arguments is good. He's a good atheist. But the irony of it is that he raises objections particularly against, say, the proof for God's existence from governance or order and design. And as you know, some of you undoubtedly know, in the last few years, Flew actually has reversed himself, and because of the intelligent design arguments, which actually I thought he refuted pretty well in his book, he now says that he's not so sure there isn't some sort of a deity behind everything. Did he die yet?
I don't know.
He may still be around. Yeah, but I mean, we all do eventually. But it's kind of ironic. He took this absolute stance against proving God's existence on this point, and then he turns around himself and then says, well, maybe this is wrong. I don't know what to make of it. But I would consider him a pretty good atheist. But even the best of them, even somebody like Flew, when it comes to things like the principle of sufficient reason, they make the same position that they all do. He ultimately just says, well, when it comes to the entire universe, maybe it's just there and there's no reason. So, I mean, for heaven's sakes, if you're going to insist that yours is the only rational philosophy, then use reason. Don't abandon it when it really matters. But you see, they have to do that. Because if you ever ask the question, why does the universe as a whole exist, you're stuck. And every atheist is in that position. He's got to simply accept the world, it's just here, there isn't any reason. How then can he claim to be the most reasonable of people? Because if you've ever dealt with a good atheist, you know, they always tell you they're the only ones with reason. You're operating by blind faith. You're just part of the stupid masses who've accepted this notion of religion, especially in a revealed sense. They're the only ones that really follow science and reason, but invariably they don't notice that science presupposes these metaphysical first principles, and especially they are not willing to apply them everywhere. If they don't apply them everywhere, then why apply them anywhere? In which case you have no reason and no science, and therefore you shouldn't be not only not an atheist, you shouldn't be even discussing the matter with anybody.
Is reason one of the divine attributes?
Well, not in the terms of ratiocination the way that we reason.
We go from point to point.
Knowledge is. But the process of reasoning is because we're human and we're kind of stupid.
I guess I'm thinking of order. Order in reasoning, for example.
Well, there is order in reasoning, but when we reason,
We do
We're
it
going from
sequentially.
potency to act.
Yeah, we're going from potency to act. God is pure act. He already knows it all. You think you know it all? Well, he does. I mean, there's certain things, you're going to be egotistic. If you're God, you have to be egotistic. What else can you be? The reason we're against these things is because they're not proper attributes of human beings. They're perfectly proper if you're God, but it's just, you're not God. I'm not God. Which I guess properly brings us to the next notion here, omniscience. Literally, God knows everything. Omniscientia. God knows all things. How do you prove it? Well, that's easy. We have knowledge. Causality implies that God has knowledge. You can use this way of reasoning again and again, by the way. Just find a property, something in the world, some perfection. It's in the world. God causes it, therefore it's in God. God possesses it simply, therefore it is found in him infinitely and identical to his very essence. So God is knowledge. God is an act of knowing. God isn't actually an eternal act of knowing, as we will see. Simplicity, okay, so causality implies that God has knowledge. Simplicity implies that God is knowledge. He is an act of knowing, but he's also an act of choosing. And his choosing and his knowing are identical. It's not that way in us. That's why we can't imagine. We can't understand. Saying that doesn't seem proper, because it isn't proper in us. Infinity implies that God is infinite knowledge. So you see, we're beginning to collect these attributes, and you can apply them together in order to get a more complete understanding. How does God knows creatures? Well, of course, he's created them, and he can observe them. But you see, there's a little problem with that. If he observes them, he's doing what we do. He's looking at them, as it were, from the outside in. God doesn't know things that way. God knows them because he knows himself. And he knows himself perfectly, and in knowing himself perfectly, he knows that to which his causality extends, and therefore he knows everything in their very root causes. He knows us from the inside out. He knows every creature from the inside out. God knows creatures perfectly by knowing himself perfectly in the act of creating all things. When we know things, we know them only through our senses. And we reason from their effects back to their nature. We can even reason philosophically to certain essential properties of things. But we're always looking from the outside in. What do we know best in all of creation? Ourselves. And that's about it. And we don't know ourselves very well, do we? But that's the truth. Everything else in the world we know only by their sensible appearances. And we observe their activities. And then we make inferences from those activities to the natures of things exhibiting the activities. What a weak, limpid, poor excuse for a knower we are. And on top of that, we don't even know it intuitively. We have to reason about it. And half the time we get it wrong. And of course, using these poor, miserable faculties we have, here we are trying to say something about God. God help us. But God doesn't, if God knew things the way we knew them, we'd have an additional problem. In order for you to see me up here, you depend on me being here, bouncing light waves off me and going back into your eyes. You depend on me in order to know me. How can God depend on his creatures? If God knew his creatures the way that we know things, he would be dependent on them. They would therefore be part of his very being. You'd be in a pantheism, among other things. God doesn't know creatures that way. God knows creatures by knowing himself. In the act of creating them, and remember, in God, all things are simple. They're all the same. This is simple. His act of creating is identical to his own divine substance. And his act of creating is identical to his own act of knowing. And it's identical to his self-reflective act of knowing himself. In the act of creating, and therefore he knows everything infinitely and perfectly in knowing himself by knowing them in their very root creative act. He literally knows us from the inside out, and perfectly, whereas all our knowledge is very imperfect. And all in the same act, he does it. This is where I struggle a little bit, because I know, as I said, I've been thinking about this for 40 years. And I don't really know what's in your minds at this point. Because what you got to do, you got to keep thinking about it. You got to keep pondering what it means for God to be absolute being, pure, unlimited, infinite, goodness, knowledge, power, eternal. We'll get to that one. And then everything that he creates, you say, but he created something. Doesn't that mean there's more now than there was before he created? Didn't we add something to him? Not really infinite, is he? Because we're here, we weren't here before, and now we are, so there's more. No, there isn't any more. There's more multiplicity, but multiplicity is just a division. It's a limitation. Every quality and perfection of existence that exists in the created world pre-exists in God. So you haven't added anything to him. You've added no perfection in the universe or in reality that wasn't there to begin with, because it already pre-existed in God. God plus the universe is no more than God in terms of existential perfection. The only thing that we've done is introduce some multiplicity, some individualization. And his knowledge is independent of time.
That's where I'm having problems with time issues.
Well, that's where we got to get God into eternity. That's going to take a little while. His knowledge is independent of time, so there's no difference from his standpoint between what to us is before and after. We are in time, but time is a limiting aspect of creation. Time is the measure of motion in reference to before and after. Measure of motion. Motion pertains to things that are in a state of potency, becoming act. Motion pertains to limited beings. Motion pertains to physical beings, which is only part of the created universe. God, as we will see shortly, is outside of time. But as far as his knowledge is concerned, time pertains to creation, not to him. So from his standpoint, and I'm sliding over into eternity here, past, present, and future are the same. But he sees it as different in us. So what is the before in us is distinct from the after. But he sees both the before and after. It's just like if you've read Macbeth and you know the whole play, you know all the parts of it, don't you? You know the order within it. You know what comes first and what comes later. All at once. You're like God. When you're reading it for the first time, though, you're going through it the way we have to go through it. We go through life, step by miserable step. And we're only in the now. The past is gone, the future isn't here yet. And the now is an ever-gliding scale. But God's knowledge entails all parts of it, because it's all equally present to him.
Some people always live in the past.
I'm getting there. Most of my existence is already there. Okay, let's see, anything else here on omniscience? I guess I don't know any more about omniscience. And we're running out of time, so we'll stop for this evening.
Can I have a question?
You just did.
I know. That's what
Sit down.
I just want to clarify, everything that we're going through here with the attributes of God, we are still in the realm of natural theology.
Oh, yeah.
This
yeah.
is none of this is based on divine revelation.
None of this is based on divine revelation. None of it at all. That's correct. You got
You know, here's what's, as I listen to you talk and what have you, with so many ways of embracing error, with so many people in the world being in error, how can we have more than a minute fraction of people even be eligible to consider themselves as philosophers?
That's precisely the most perfect argument you could give for the need for divine revelation.
And that's the one St. Thomas does give.
Yeah. That's exactly the reason for the need for divine revelation, because if you just left it to philosophers, we wouldn't get very far.
How can a normal Chinese person become a philosopher? Just to pick on one
Well,
group of the world.
he could, but there's one point that has to be noticed, and that is that much of this metaphysics was developed under the influence of Christian revelation. Aristotle went probably as far as the human mind could go on its own, and amazingly so. But there are insights that were not fully developed, even by him.
But over half the world is atheist.
Oh, I don't
know.
know. I don't think that's. I'm
The
not-
practical atheist.
Yeah, a lot. I'm not sure that's theoretically so.
I mean, would you say, what would... if
You could get people to be atheists. I mean, we did that with the poor Russian people. 70 years of communism turned them into atheists. And because they brainwashed them into atheism. And we talked about the church in silence, but when we got there, we found it really was silent. That they really did their job. I had a student from Russia back around 1990, and she said, we never knew anything about God, except what they were told that there wasn't one. So man can stand in a state of ignorance, but at the same time, the historical foundations of human knowledge have always been impacted by the Garden of Eden. Because if you go back, the anthropologists initially argued that on the basis of evolution, that religion had to slowly develop, and that it started with polytheism and then eventually became monotheism. But when the anthropologists back in the 1900s started going out and met these so-called primitive peoples, they found that most all of them, if you penetrated deeply enough, had a monotheistic origin and a monotheistic God at the top of all their multiple gods. And that the evolutionists were just academics talking off the top of their ivory towers. It wasn't what you actually found. So left to do its natural state, whether by reason alone or by the revelation that took place in Eden, for some reason, all mankind had an original notion of a supreme being in some form. This, in turn, may have been lost, and perhaps through the efforts of atheists today has been lost by many, many people, but that's not the natural state of man. But you still need divine revelation to pick up all of the errors that would arise, and mankind forgets, and he gets it all mixed up, and he needs a little help.
I mean, do you have any colleagues that are East Asians,
I don't have any colleagues.
I'll say that.
I have a friend who is a Hindu.
Okay,
Yeah, I guess that would qualify. And he's the one that told me there's 1.1 billion Hindus, which would be 1,100 million, and he said 300 million of us hold a concept of God that's virtually identical to the natural concept of deity that I'm describing, and the other 800 million are pantheists. But even they've got the notion of God, and they've got a chief God, so they could be worse.
but it's not unicity.
If they got a top God, that's a unicity. All these others are, everybody's got little minor gods running around. We even have devils. Okay, I guess we're out of time. We're going. Bring some questions next week. If I'm not here, I won't answer them.